The information provided is not a substitute for legal and other professional advice where the facts and circumstances warrant. People should always consult their own legal or other professional advisors and discuss the facts and circumstances that apply to their specific circumstances. The information shared on Ask the Landlord is for educational purposes only.
Hello, everyone. We're back with another episode of Ask the Landlord with our favorite landlord, Albert Dweck. I'm Melissa. I'm one of Albert's producers and a former New York City renter. And together, we're going to be asking this landlord some questions. But today, we have a special guest on the podcast, another landlord, and the founder and president of Flatiron Real Estate Advisors, Stephen Ancona. Welcome to the show, Stephen.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Just to start things off today, Stephen, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? How'd you get into the business? Let's see if anything overlaps with Albert. So just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I have a little bit of a family background in real estate, but I really ended up in real estate through kind of a love, might sound strange, but of environmental issues. I started working at an environmental consulting firm when I was still in college. And we actually embarked on a program of buying environmentally contaminated sites, cleaning them up, redeveloping them. I did that for a bunch of years. And then I decided to expand that and start my own company. January of 2000, I started Flatiron to continue doing that kind of work, but also buying underperforming, poorly utilized residential buildings in New York City, a lot of them rent regulated. So the idea was to buy them, fix them up, redevelop them, improve them, and create investments that way. And then through the course of that work, we kind of started getting requested to do third-party management, so actually managing the properties. So we kind of have an investment business and we have a property management business, which at one point we were up to like 1,500 units under management. Today it's smaller. Today it's about 600 or 700 units. That's kind of the big picture. I'm also a professor at NYU. I teach a class in their master's program in real estate at the Shack Institute. So I teach like one class a semester in residential development. And, it's, I would say the big picture is I always loved real estate, the idea of buying, developing, improving all different types of spaces.
Got it. Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for joining us today also. I really appreciate that. And Stephen and I are good friends. And what I wanted to do here also is get another perspective of another landlord. And also what we're going to do distinguish today a bit differently is, I get the residents are, the tenants, but also it's important to understand there's landlords, there's building owners, right? And then there's the management of the properties that you're in. So very often, sometimes they're the same and sometimes they're different. So, sometimes you have small landlords that it's like managing their own property, and then sometimes there are third-party managers. And, very often you find, as a tenant, you find yourself with an issue or whatever, and you're like, oh, I'm dealing with the property manager, but there's an owner that is also has a interest and concern, obviously, in the building. So sometimes that happens. There's another party that you have to deal with, or that that the manager has to go back to. So Stephen's going to highlight that differences really in that there's a property management concern, and that might be different from the owner. So, right, Melissa, does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
No, and as a tenant, you could see how, like, there's a landlord and there's a property manager. How does that work? Who's the person that I deal with? You had those questions in the past?
Yeah, like sometimes you're not sure, who am I talking to when I'm communicating about my broken refrigerator, right? Is this someone who actually cares about the building, or is it like the owner? Like, it's good to know who you're communicating with for better communication, right?
Right. That's very important. That's right. That's right.
So, Stephen, do you want to tell us a little bit about like your experience with some property management managers? Who are they? What do they do? And any advice you have for tenants dealing with property
Sure,
managers?
sure. So, it's the property manager is very often the front line and the face of the property. So, a lot of tenants think that the manager has the final say in everything, but they don't always realize is that there's actually an ownership that tells the manager what to do, right? So, for example, let's say you have a lease renewal, right? And you ask the manager, or the manager communicates with you and says, this is what your new rent will be if you renew your lease. And you may feel, oh, that's a really big increase. That's not fair. And the tenant may get angry at the manager, but the manager, you have to understand, is just the messenger. That property manager is typically a salaried employee, works for a management company, and is really just getting their direction from ownership, right? So, um, you know, at the same time, maybe there's a problem in your apartment or in the building. You need a new something. You need a new refrigerator. Um, the manager can't just necessarily spend the owner's money without the owner's approval. If if for some reason the owner isn't giving the manager the proper resources to make repairs, the manager ends up being the person stuck in the middle. So these people, just to give you an idea of who they are and what their backgrounds are, property managers generally have some significant experience in how to run a property. Aside from administering your application for an apartment, issuing your lease, collecting your rent, right? It's their job to collect your rent. So they automatically kind of get a bad rap, right? They have to get your money every month. Um, and if you don't, they're the ones who have to go and call you and email you and pester you to pay your rent. That's their job, to collect the rent. They pay they handle payment of all the expenses for a building. They usually supervise the building maintenance staff. They have to deal with the city and all the regulations and inspections that happen. They have to deal with all the vendors who provide services to your building. If there's a violation against the building, they have to make sure it gets addressed. Um, they get requests from banks who have mortgages on your property for reports and other issues. It's and I can tell you in general, it's a pretty thankless job. They're usually, 95% of the feedback they get from tenants, whether it's online reviews or emails, or whatever, tends to be negative. And it's very rare that a tenant will recognize the hard work of a manager and say, thank you, or I really appreciate the job you're doing. Things are running so smoothly in my building, I don't even realize it, right? So when you have a building that's running smoothly, there's usually a manager behind it who's making sure that all happens.
That's very
And when
helpful.
it's not running smoothly, they're the one who has to deal with it, make sure the building has financial resources to deal with the problem, and get ownership approval for lots of things. So does that answer
That,
your?
yeah, that's very helpful, Stephen. One of the things that I was on a call recently representing one of an owner that we handle their property, and it was a very difficult situation. The owner wanted something, right? And it was fine, within her right to have, like, not to renew a lease or something. And and I and I and I walked it through with the owner, because I knew that as a property manager, we were going to be put in that difficult position of having to be the front line person that has to deal with this problem. And I said, because the owner didn't want to renew the person's been paying rent, and for the owner's reason, whatever the reason was, and it's like no one wants to hear that like bad news. But as the managers, very often you have to do that on the behalf of the owner. So it's not an easy position sometimes to be in. Of course, not having the resources, but even sometimes when you have the resources, you're a representative or proxy of the owner. So I know how hard that is. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are situations too. I could think of one or two cases where the manager is really caught in the middle. So there was one instance where I don't know if you guys are familiar, but when I know you're familiar, Albert, but when there's a problem with like any small gas leak that's detected in a building, and let's say your boiler is fired by gas, it's powered by gas. Con Ed will instantly shut down the gas, which means your building doesn't have heat, right? And you cannot turn that gas back on until you go through a very lengthy process. And Con Ed, local utility company, is notoriously slow in executing that process. It can take 6 months. And even if you bring in a temporary external boiler, that also is a process that can take time, like an emergency temporary boiler. And those things don't always work well. So we had a situation like that at one building that we manage on behalf of ownership. And it took almost 6 months to get the regular boiler back up and running. And of course, the manager in the middle gets a ton of grief from the tenants. Understandably, they're upset, but you go on my company's Google reviews, I could point to the negative reviews that we get from tenants who were in that specific building that had that specific problem, blaming our company as the property manager when there were so many things out of our control that we couldn't help. But the manager was working really hard, after hours, weekends, constantly calling Con Ed, constantly trying to handle the contractors, trying to deal with the owners to make sure they funded what needed to be funded to fix the problem. The manager was stuck in the middle of all this, and instead of any thank yous, just got grief and bad reviews.
Yeah.
So
I get it.
It's what I will say also is that managers remember the tenants who are appreciative.
For sure.
So if you're a tenant in a building and you're in communication at all with your property manager, there's an expression I use a lot with my managers and in dealing with tenants, is that you catch more bees with honey. And it always pays in any business relationship, because that's what it is, to treat the people who are working to help you, treat them well, show some appreciation. Even if it's their job, you could still say thank you, and when it comes time for that renewal and the manager is the go-between between you and the owner of the property, if you've been very nice to your manager, they might advocate for you and say, hey, you know what? This is a really good tenant. They're very nice. Whenever there's a problem, they're very reasonable. Let's give them a little break.
So this, I think the title might be Property Managers Are People Too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Is there anything you suggest, like you said, be nice to them? Like right off the bat, when we sign a lease, let's say, what's something the tenant can do to show like preliminary gratitude towards the property manager? Like, we're not talking baking cookies or sending a gift card. Like, would an email suffice? Like, what do you suggest?
You know what? It's even just a note. Yeah, just an email to say, hi, this is Jane. I just moved into the apartment. I just want to thank you for an easy process and getting the lease done. And I'm looking forward to staying here. And thank you for helping this happen. Because when Jane applied for that apartment, the manager processed the application, drafted the lease, worked with maintenance to make sure the apartment was ready, and made sure the building was ready to receive the tenant. Did all those things. They don't get paid anything extra for that. They just did their job. It's kind of like when you have a waiter, their job is to bring you food. When they put if you treat them nicely and say, "Oh, thank you so much," and maybe chit chat them a little bit, maybe they'll bring you an extra drink, or it's just a more pleasant relationship. So if you start out on that foot of like having a nice rapport with your manager and showing some appreciation, when you have the leaky faucet, the manager might say, "Oh, Jane has a leaky faucet now. Let me make sure that happens right away." Because you have to understand that manager isn't just managing your building usually, unless it's a really big building. Usually that manager is handling 10 small buildings, multiple different maintenance people, multiple different situations at the same time. But you'd be surprised how much quicker someone responds to you when you're nice to them.
It's a great point.
And they remember that.
I think that's and I think that's what one of the big things we're trying to accomplish with this podcast is to have what is unfortunately two sides right now, right? Landlords and tenants, to have them both realize that there's people on the other side, that, it's about communication, working together, Steve, I want to get into it a little bit also with sometimes I think there's a couple things. First is I think there's from a property manager's perspective, like a resident, they want to hear certain things from the property manager, even if it's not in the property manager's control. Like a resident wants to know if there's an issue, what's being done about the issue, right? And when it's going to be resolved, and what's going to be done in the future about it, or from stop it from happening, and or if there's compensation, what that's going to look like. And I think when I've had a problem being a resident or a tenant with the property manager, there was a failing in one of those categories, meaning I wasn't communicated appropriately with or properly about what was going on, about what was going to be done about it, by when and whom, when someone was going to tell me what was going on, and what was going to be done to avoid it in the future. And then, of course, to your point earlier about those people not having heat, I mean, they paid for heat, from a resident's perspective, right, Melissa? You're like, I'm a tenant. How could I not have heat in my apartment? I get that there's a roof over my head, right? But I should definitely have some kind of compensation for that, because I'm not in a place that's everything that I signed up for in a lease under my warrant of habitability. There's an agreement that I need to, have what I'm supposed to get. So and I think property managers, again, are in this weird position that they're in the middle of this conversation where they go to the landlord and say, listen, these people didn't have services. They are deserving of some kind of credit, and we should give that to them. Now, it's up to the landlord or the owner to actually authorize that, but the property manager needs to be able to, a good property manager needs to know that those are the things that need to get done and communicated.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. So in the case of, like, let's say the heat goes out for a day and then, a company goes and repairs it. If you're a tenant and you're instantly saying to your manager, "Oh, I deserve a credit for that because I didn't have heat for a day," that's not reasonable, right? You could own your own house and the heat could go out and you have to call a repair person and it gets fixed. So if something is completed in a reasonable amount of time, to try to jump on that right away and try to get a credit if there's a 1-day problem or even a 2-day problem, I don't think that that's appropriate. However, if there's a prolonged problem, I agree. An owner should give some credit against the rent. It could be a percentage. It could be, if it's a small problem, it's 5%. If it's a big problem, it could be 20%, 25%. Depends
Agreed.
on the problem.
Agreed. And I one of the things I noticed also, I'm gonna from a manager's perspective or a landlord's perspective, it's hard to give a credit when you don't know the extent of the issue. Like you might say to the tenant, look, here's the situation. We don't know. We're working to resolve it. We don't know when we're going to. We're going to do something, but when we know the extent of it. So you might, to your point, is like the tenant might be going, I don't have heat for 1 day, 2 days, but then you say, look, if it's going to be a prolonged period, we're gonna assess it, and then when we solve it, we're going to come to some kind of credit resolution.
Right. Yeah. No. A good manager will do their best to jockey between the tenants and ownership and say, look, people don't have heat, so we're gonna, there's like a good manager will find solutions too. Like, okay, we're gonna find safe electric heaters, right? That will supply temporarily for free. We'll give people a credit off their electric bills because it's going to cost them to heat it instead of us paying for it if that's the situation. Like a good manager knows how to react in these situations and also knows how to. And by the way, most good managers will advocate for tenants to ownership and say, look, these people deserve a little break because they've had this big problem. I'm recommending we do something for them. Now, if you have an obstinate owner who says no, now the manager is in this horrible position, right?
This is when a manager sometimes.
I'm really sorry. I've recommended, and it's hard for the manager to kind of sell the owner down the river because they work for the owner. So it's hard for them to say, I recommended it, but the owner refused.
Have you been in a situation where, as a property manager, you've had to go to an owner and said, listen, I can't manage your property if you're not going to?
Yes. We've had a couple of instances where we were working as a third-party manager, and it turned out that the owners were not responsible owners, were not upright, wouldn't fund necessary repairs just for basic warranty of habitability issues, wouldn't give us the resources to do what we needed to do to properly maintain a property. And in those cases, we did tell ownership, look, we can't work for you anymore. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We've done that.
Very hard. Very hard.
We have certain clients that we've had for many, many, many years. And just like everybody else, people go through their ups and downs financially. And there have been times where, certain clients, if they're tight for cash, we're stuck in this difficult position where we're working for someone for a very long time. We feel loyalty to them, and we're trying to help them through a difficult patch. Like, let's say through COVID that just happened, where, people thought they didn't have to pay rent at all, but expected building services to be maintained consistently. And if a major repair would come up and the owner didn't have the money for it, it's a very difficult situation. And now we're in the middle trying to keep the building going on a very, very limited budget. And we're not gonna kind of sell out the owner and say, oh yeah, tell the tenants, oh yeah, this guy's terrible, he's not funding it, you're right. Like, it's a very tricky position to be in. So we do our best. We kind of, we end up with the bad reviews online, but it's kind of, we're kind of, we get stuck in the middle.
I get that. That. Well, thank you for that.
Can I say what? I was thinking one thing. Can I just say one thing?
Of course.
I was thinking, I hate the word landlord.
Me too. That's why we're here.
I hate the word landlord.
Yeah, you're not a lord.
I always, whenever there's a lease or whatever, I always try to tell, like, don't put the word landlord. I'm not the lord of anybody. Put owner. Right. I find that word to be so. I hate the word. I know that's really I don't want to lord over anybody.
One of the reasons why we started my own house. One of the reasons why we started the podcast was because we're trying to come up with we're trying to fix this whole thing. So I got
Yeah.
you. You're certainly not
It's
the
it's
lord over
it's
anybody.
very it's a very feudal term. Yeah.
We're
We're here to
breaking the
break the
stigma.
stigma.
That's what Alan
Break
said.
the
Yeah, it's
stigma.
great.
Okay, good, because it's a terrible word, and I think it's vilified. It's vilified.
And that's exactly what Albert said. That's why we're here to unvilify the word. And, maybe I don't think it'll change anytime soon, but we're not going to change the name of the show. But
Go
one
ahead.
last thing
Yeah.
about property managers. You guys kind of touched on it, but not really. So as a tenant, is there ever a situation where like I've communicated with the property managers, they're not solving my problem. I want to talk to the owner. Let me talk to that person directly. I was This was not in New York, but I was not given access. What is that? Does that ever happen? Is that allowed? Is
Absolutely.
it frowned
I've
upon? Talk to
I've
me.
done I've done that. Both myself as a tenant, and then I've done that with tenants where they had an issue with and they wanted to speak to the owner. Um, but I also understand the role of the property manager is to manage the property, right? So the owner says, look, it's the property manager's job to handle this, right? And that's why I hired them. Now, as long as you understand, as long as the property manager understands that and the tenant understands that, it's fair. I think it's a fine request to for the tenant to make an appeal to ownership. I've done that myself, and really where I've seen it done in a couple of situations. One is I was dissatisfied with the manager, and I didn't, and they weren't doing those job of the things that I said what I said before, which were one, acknowledge the situation, two, tell me what you're doing about it, right? Three, tell me when it's going to be solved, right? Four, tell me what my compensation is. When they don't have those four things answered, and the manager consistently doesn't answer that, as a tenant, you have every right to keep pushing until you get the answer, right? So, and you should be, and I could tell that the owner as a manager and say, listen, I need the answers to these questions. These people want them. And if you're not, either you're going to give me the answer, empower me as the manager, right? And I'll answer on your behalf, or, the tenant wants to speak to you directly, and here's why it's important to speak to them. So that's my answer to your question. So I do think it's appropriate for an owner to get involved. Certainly, to number one, help the tenant the best way possible, right? Two, help the manager help the tenant, right? Um, and sometimes that's all we have. Like that's the final straw is that the coming from the owner, Stephen and I as managers get put in the position sometimes like that it's in the middleman. So when we're able to facilitate a conversation directly between the owner and the land and the tenant, it helps. Steve, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, something to remember is that property managers, like everybody else, are human. They're not infallible. They make mistakes. They might be overwhelmed with some other issues going on at some other building at work, and they haven't gotten back to you timely on your issue. It happens. We do our best, on our management business. We do our best, um, but the management business is a very labor intensive one with very like slim, like as a business, it has very slim financial margins. So unfortunately, managers tend to get spread thin. And so if you're in a situation where it's, the manager just isn't getting back to you over and over and over, and you want to reach out to the owner, you could try that. Some owners just won't respond. Um,
It's
the
better to
only other
do it
thing
with
I
the
could suggest,
cooperation of the manager, obviously.
yeah. So I mean, the only thing I suggest is like, if you've tried only emailing, maybe try calling. If you've tried that, maybe try texting. Like most mid or large size managers today, they all operate using technology. We use technology. We have text capabilities. We have email capabilities through a portal. Try those channels. So one of the things we hate, right, because our company tends to be very responsive to maintenance requests. We have a system set up. We have maintenance people. One thing we found, and this often happens with non-tech savvy tenants, especially kind of like older tenants, the second that there's a problem, or maybe they had a bad owner or manager before we came along, they will automatically call the city for any problem instead of just talking to us first. They will actually make maintenance. They will call 311 in New York City, 311. You could call the city and complain about whatever it is. If you think there's not enough heat, or if you think something needs to be repaired, you can make a complaint to the city, and the city will come out and inspect and cause a violation. Now what happens? If you just called the manager would have told the super to fix it, right? Instead, when you do that, now the manager not only has to fix the problem, which is no problem, they'll fix it, but now they also have to clear a violation. You're making more work for the manager.
Plus, there's a delay, I think, also. Now that you're talking about it, you're subjecting the government agency to get there and react on time and then tell the manager. So that's just going to take time also.
Right.
So, we're big advocates here at Ask the Landlord of, picking up the phone and or whatever, communicating effectively person to person. Hey, here's what's going on. Here's what I need. Here's my situation. And then the same thing from landlords and managers back to say, listen, instead of, putting technology in the way also, it's just, making that human connection where you're saying, listen, here, I'm going to call the person back and I'm going to tell them this is what's going on.
And that goes back to the beginning of the conversation, right? When you first get your new apartment, say thank you to your manager. We have some tenants over the years who send my managers holiday cards. We even have one who brings one of my managers cookies every year at Christmas time, and like now that same manager gets so much grief all the time, but she remembers that tenant who's always nice and brings her the cookies. And you know what? Guess what? When that tenant has a leaky faucet, guess whose leaky faucet's going to get fixed first?
That's so smart. So smart. That's great advice.
It just they're people. They're people, and they're stretched thin like we all are.
Love your property managers. They're people too.
That's it. That's the message.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Albert. That was really good. Very, very informative. I think you touched on a lot of good points. And again, Ask the Landlord is about bridging the gap between landlords, owners, and tenants. And I think another thing we're doing, and we don't even realize, is we're just trying to create nicer, kinder people out there. Start off on a nice foot and good things will come your way, right?
Absolutely.
For more episodes, please subscribe to Ask the Landlord on your favorite podcast platform. We'd appreciate it if you left a review on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to watch the show, check out our Ask the Landlord YouTube channel. If you have a question for Albert, feel free to contact him on Instagram at Ask the Landlord and check out his TikTok at Ask the Landlord. Bridging the gap between landlords and tenants, this has been Ask the Landlord. Thanks for listening.